Thomas Harrison sat at his desk, staring at the bright red circle he had drawn on his calendar. In just 2 months, his father would marry Sarah Mitchell, and the thought made his stomach turn. The 12-year-old boy looked at the family photo on his desk, one taken just 3 years ago with his mother, before cancer took her away. His fingers traced over his mother's smiling face as tears formed in his eyes. The sound of laughter floated up from downstairs. Sarah's voice, always sweet like honey when his father was around, carried through the old house. Thomas heard his father, James Harrison, laughing at whatever story Sarah was telling him. It was probably another tale about her successful real estate deals or her adventures traveling the world. She showed up out of nowhere, Thomas mumbled to himself, thinking back to that day 6 months ago when Sarah first appeared in their lives. It had been a normal Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was doing his homework at the kitchen table when his father came home from work, practically bouncing with excitement. James Harrison, usually serious and focused after his long days at the construction company he owned, had a smile that lit up his whole face. "Tommy," his father had said, using the nickname that only he was allowed to use, "I met someone special today." Thomas remembered how his father explained that he had been looking at properties for his business when Sarah Mitchell walked into the real estate office. She was the new agent, having just moved to town from California. According to his father, their eyes met across the room, and they talked for hours after his meeting was over. Now, 6 months later, they were engaged. Everything had happened so fast that Thomas felt like his head was spinning. The boy walked to his window and watched as Sarah's expensive red sports car sat in their driveway. She claimed it was a gift from a grateful client, but Thomas wondered how a regular real estate agent could get such expensive gifts. His mother had been a real estate agent too, and she never received anything like that. Downstairs, Thomas could hear Sarah talking about the wedding plans. Her voice carried through the house as she discussed flowers, cakes, and guest lists with his father. "James, darling, I think we should have the ceremony at St. Michael's Church. It's the most beautiful church in town, and I've always dreamed of walking down that long aisle." Thomas rolled his eyes. Last week, she had said she always dreamed of a beach wedding. The week before that, it was a garden ceremony. Her stories kept changing, but his father never seemed to notice. The boy picked up the small notebook he had started keeping in his desk drawer. In it, he wrote down all the strange things he noticed about Sarah, like how she sometimes answered her phone using different names when she thought no one was listening, or how she always changed the subject when anyone asked about her family or her past. A soft knock on his door made Thomas quickly hide the notebook. "Come in," he called out. His father opened the door, his face glowing with happiness. "Hey, Tommy, why don't you come downstairs? Sarah made your favorite chocolate chip cookies." "They're not my favorite," Thomas wanted to say. His favorite were the oatmeal raisin cookies his mom used to make. Instead, he forced a smile. "Okay, Dad, I'll be down in a minute." James Harrison looked at his son with concern in his eyes. "I know this is a big change, buddy, but Sarah really wants to be part of our family. She's trying so hard to connect with you." Thomas nodded, but inside, he felt uneasy. Something about Sarah just didn't feel right. The way she looked at their family photos when she thought no one was watching. Not with sadness or respect, but with calculation in her eyes. The mysterious phone calls she took in the garden late at night. The way she had convinced his father to add her name to their family bank account after just 4 months of dating. As Thomas followed his father downstairs, he made a decision. He would figure out who Sarah Mitchell really was, even if no one else seemed to see past her perfect smile and sweet voice. His mother had always taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him that Sarah Mitchell was hiding something big. Looking at his father's happy face, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders. He had to protect his dad, but he would need proof before anyone would believe him. The real question was, would he find it before the wedding? Thomas sat in the school library during lunch break, his sandwich forgotten beside him as he stared at his computer screen. He had been searching for information about Sarah Mitchell for the past week, but finding almost nothing made him even more suspicious. For someone who claimed to be a successful real estate agent in California, she had no online presence at all. His best friend, Mike, leaned over his shoulder. "Still playing detective?" Mike asked, taking a bite of his apple. "Maybe you're just overthinking this, Tommy. Your dad seems really happy." "Something's not right," Thomas insisted, closing another empty search tab. Yesterday, I heard her on the phone talking about moving money offshore. Who does that? The boys' conversation was interrupted by a text message from Thomas's father. Sarah's moving in this weekend, it read, followed by happy emojis. Thomas's heart sank. Everything was moving too fast. That Saturday, Thomas watched from his bedroom window as his father and Sarah's friends carried boxes into their house. One box caught his attention. It was marked private in thick black letters, and Sarah grabbed it quickly when one of the movers tried to help with it. Later that afternoon, while Sarah was busy directing the placement of her furniture in the living room, Thomas walked past the master bedroom. The mysterious box sat in the corner, slightly open. He knew he shouldn't look, but his curiosity won over his guilt. Making sure no one was coming, Thomas slipped into the room. His hand shook as he opened the box wider. Inside, he found several wigs of different colors and styles, multiple cell phones, and a stack of ID cards with Sarah's picture, but different names. Linda Peterson, Rachel Adams, and Maria Santos. "What are you doing?" Sarah's sharp voice made Thomas jump. He spun around to find her standing in the doorway, her usually sweet smile replaced by a cold stare. I was looking for Dad's phone charger," Thomas lied, his heart pounding. Sarah's face softened instantly, but her eyes remained hard. "Of course, sweetie. But it's not nice to go through other people's things. Let's keep this our little secret, okay?" Her voice had a warning tone that made Thomas's skin crawl. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the ideas and wigs. While getting a glass of water at midnight, he overheard Sarah on the phone in the backyard. "Everything's going according to plan," she whispered. "The old fool doesn't suspect anything. Once we're married, I'll have access to everything. Yes, the company too. The kid. Don't worry about him. No one believes children anyway." Thomas recorded the conversation on his phone, his hands trembling. He needed more evidence, but now he was sure. Sarah was planning something terrible. The next morning, Thomas pretended to be sick so he could stay home from school. While Sarah was out showing houses to clients, he carefully searched the master bathroom for his father's missing blood pressure medicine that had mysteriously disappeared last week. Opening the cabinet under the sink, he found something much worse. Hidden behind cleaning supplies were prescription bottles with different names, all for the same sleeping medication. Thomas remembered how his father had been unusually tired lately, always going to bed early after drinking the tea Sarah made him. Taking pictures with his phone, Thomas documented everything. He also found bank statements showing large transfers from his father's account to unknown offshore accounts. Sarah had convinced his father to give her access to his accounts to help manage the household expenses. Just then, Thomas heard the front door open. Sarah was home early. He quickly put everything back exactly as he had found it and rushed to his room. His heart was racing as he added the new information to his growing file of evidence on his laptop. That evening at dinner, Sarah announced she had moved up the wedding date. "I found the perfect venue, but it's only available next month," she said sweetly. "I hope that's not too soon." James Harrison beamed at his fiancée. "Sooner the better, right, Tommy?" Thomas forced himself to smile and nod, but inside he was panicking. He now had less than a month to prove that Sarah Mitchell was a fraud before she could steal everything from them. Looking at his father's happy face, Thomas felt tears forming in his eyes. He had to protect his dad, but he was running out of time. As Sarah caught his eye across the table, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. In that moment, Thomas knew she understood exactly what he was trying to do. This wasn't just about protecting his father anymore. It was becoming a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Thomas couldn't sleep that night. His mind kept going back to the prescription bottles and fake IDs he had found. At 3 in the morning, he opened his laptop and started a more detailed investigation. This time, instead of searching for Sarah Mitchell, he began looking for news stories about wedding scams. His eyes grew wide as he scrolled through article after article about women who married wealthy men and then disappeared with their money. The stories all followed the same pattern: quick romances, rushed weddings, and stolen fortunes. The next morning at breakfast, Sarah placed a cup of coffee in front of James. "Drink up, darling. You look so tired lately." She shot a quick warning glance at Thomas, who noticed her slipping something into his father's cup when he wasn't looking. After his father left for work, Thomas pretended to leave for school, but actually hid behind their garage. He watched as Sarah made several phone calls, speaking in different accents each time. Using his phone, he recorded her conversations. "The wedding's next month," she said in one call, using a British accent. "The company alone is worth 5 million. Yes, I'll transfer everything before I disappear. The sleeping pills in his coffee are working perfectly." Thomas's hands shook as he recorded everything. He needed help, but who would believe a 12-year-old kid? Then he remembered his Aunt Jenny, his mother's sister who was a police detective in another city. During lunch break at school, Thomas called her from the empty library. "Aunt Jenny," he whispered, "I need your help. It's about Dad's fiancée." Jenny listened carefully as Thomas explained everything he had discovered. "Send me everything you have," she said seriously. "And Thomas, be very careful. Women like this can be dangerous when cornered." After school, Thomas went to the local library and used their computer to search newspaper archives. Suddenly, his heart stopped. There on the screen was a familiar face, Sarah's face, but under the name Sharon Morris. The article was from 3 years ago. "Wedding scammer disappears with elderly man's life savings." As Thomas read more articles, he found 5 different cases in 3 states. Each time, she used a different name, but it was always the same beautiful woman with the same sweet smile. She would marry wealthy men, empty their bank accounts, and vanish. When Thomas got home, he found Sarah going through his room. She pretended to be cleaning, but he saw her checking his drawers and under his mattress. "Looking for something?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah turned around, her fake smile in place. "Just tidying up, sweetie. Your father told me you used to be such a neat boy when your mother was alive." She walked closer to Thomas. "It must be so hard, losing your mother so young. You know, accidents can happen to anyone, at any time." The threat in her voice was clear. Thomas felt his heart racing but stood his ground. "Yes, they can," he replied, meeting her gaze. That evening, Thomas heard Sarah arguing on the phone in the backyard again. "The kid knows something." "No, I can't just get rid of him. It would raise too many questions." "I'll handle it. Just get everything ready for the transfer." Thomas quietly went to his father's home office and found recent bank statements. His eyes widened in horror. Nearly half of his father's savings was already gone, transferred to various overseas accounts. The construction company's accounts showed unusual activity too. Using his father's computer, Thomas discovered emails from the company's accountant raising concerns about large unauthorized transfers. Sarah had somehow convinced James to give her access to the business accounts as well. The next day, Thomas skipped soccer practice and went to the local police station. But when he tried to explain his suspicions, the officer just smiled kindly and said, "Son, I know divorce and remarriage can be hard on kids. Give Sarah a chance." Frustrated but not defeated, Thomas realized he needed hard evidence that no one could ignore. He remembered his mother's words. "The truth always comes out, Tommy. You just have to be brave enough to keep looking for it." That night, as Thomas lay in bed planning his next move, he heard Sarah's voice drift up from downstairs. "Everything's ready. After the wedding next week, James Harrison won't know what hit him." Thomas clutched his phone with all his evidence. He had less than a week to stop the wedding and save his father. The question was, how do you prove someone is a criminal when all the adults think you're just a jealous kid? With only 5 days left before the wedding, Thomas spent every free moment gathering evidence. His room had become a secret investigation center, with photos and notes hidden under his mattress. The usual soccer posters on his walls now helped hide printouts of news articles about Sarah's, or rather Sharon's, previous crimes. One afternoon, while pretending to do homework, Thomas received an urgent email from Aunt Jenny. "I found something big," she wrote. "Sarah Mitchell doesn't exist, but Sharon Morris does, and she's wanted in 3 states. I'm sending you official police reports. Be careful, Tommy. She's more dangerous than we thought." Thomas downloaded the files with shaking hands. The police reports showed everything. 5 ruined families, 3 stolen fortunes, and 2 mysterious deaths of former husbands. Sharon Morris was not just a con artist, she was something much worse. Later that day, Sarah caught Thomas alone in the kitchen. Her sweet smile was gone. "You know, Thomas," she said, playing with a large kitchen knife while making dinner, "accidents happen all the time. Children fall downstairs, or get hit by cars, or just disappear. She pointed the knife at him while reaching for a carrot. Especially nosy children who don't mind their own business. Thomas tried to keep his voice steady. Is that what happened to Richard Cooper? He asked, watching her face carefully. Richard Cooper was one of her former husbands who had died mysteriously after starting to ask questions about his missing money. Sarah's face turned white, then red with anger. She slammed the knife down on the cutting board. Where did you hear that name? She demanded, her voice shaking with rage. I hear lots of things, Thomas replied, backing toward the door. Like how Sharon Morris is wanted by the FBI. Before Sarah could respond, they heard James's car pulling into the driveway. Sarah's sweet smile returned instantly, but her eyes remained cold and threatening. Not a word, she whispered, or your father might have an unfortunate accident too. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his father's safety. The sleeping pills Sarah was putting in his coffee, the missing money, the threatening way she looked at Thomas. Everything was getting more dangerous by the day. Around midnight, Thomas heard Sarah on the phone again. He crept to the top of the stairs to listen. Everything's ready, she was saying. After the wedding, we'll transfer the remaining money. The sleeping pills will make it look like he had an accident while driving. Yes, just like the others. The boy? Don't worry about him. Once his father is gone, he'll go to foster care. No one will believe him. Thomas recorded the conversation on his phone, his hands trembling so much he'd almost dropped it. This wasn't just about money anymore. Sarah was planning to kill his father. The next morning, Thomas tried to warn his father at breakfast. Dad, have you noticed you're always tired after drinking coffee that Sarah makes? But James just laughed. That's because I'm working hard to give us all a wonderful wedding, Tommy. You'll understand when you're older. Sarah is the best thing that's happened to us since, he paused, looking sad, since her mother. Thomas wanted to scream the truth, but he knew his father wouldn't believe him without solid proof. Adults never believe kids about important things without evidence. After his father left for work, Thomas started preparing for his final plan. He connected his laptop to a small projector he had borrowed from school. He organized all the evidence, the police reports, the news articles, the photos of fake IDs, and the recordings of Sarah's threats. The wedding was in 3 days. Thomas had everything ready, but fear kept him awake at night. What if something went wrong? What if Sarah hurt his father before he could expose her? What if no one believed him? But when he looked at his mother's photo on his desk, he found his courage again. I won't let her hurt Dad, he whispered to the picture. I promise. Thomas knew he had only one chance to stop the wedding and save his father's life. Everything had to be perfect. As he finished uploading the last piece of evidence to his laptop, he heard Sarah's footsteps coming up the stairs. Quickly, he hid everything and opened his math book. The next 3 days would decide everything: his father's life, their future, and whether justice would finally catch up with Sharon Morris. The morning of the wedding arrived with dark clouds hanging over St. Michael's Church. Thomas stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his bow tie with trembling fingers. His backpack sat ready on his bed, containing his laptop, the projector, and all the evidence he had gathered. Tommy, are you ready? His father called from downstairs. We need to get to the church early. Thomas took one last look at his mother's picture. Watch over us today, Mom, he whispered, then grabbed his backpack and headed downstairs. At the church, everything looked perfect. White flowers decorated every pew, and soft music played as guests arrived. Thomas noticed Sarah's supposed family members. All people he suspected were part of her criminal group. They were watching him carefully. In the church office, where Thomas was supposed to wait with his father, James Harrison was beaming with happiness. You look so handsome, Tommy, he said, straightening his own tie. Today's going to be perfect. Sarah's going to be your new mom. Those words made Thomas's stomach turn. He checked his watch. Only 30 minutes until the ceremony. He had to set up his equipment now. Dad, I need to use the bathroom, Thomas said, clutching his backpack. Hurry back, son. The ceremony starts soon. Thomas rushed to the church's audio-visual room where Mike, his best friend, was waiting. They had convinced the church coordinator that they were preparing a special wedding video. Did you connect the projector to the main system? Thomas asked, pulling out his laptop. Mike nodded. Everything's ready. But Tommy, are you sure about this? What if you're wrong? I'm not wrong, Thomas said firmly, opening his files. She's planning to kill my dad. Suddenly, they heard Sarah's voice outside the door. Check everywhere, she was saying. That brat is up to something. Find him. Thomas and Mike froze. Heavy footsteps passed by their door, and they held their breath until the sound faded. She knows, Mike whispered. That's why we have to do this now, Thomas replied, his voice shaking but determined. The wedding music started playing. Through the small window, Thomas could see the guests taking their seats. His father stood at the altar, smiling proudly. Sarah appeared at the church entrance, looking beautiful in her white dress, wearing her fake innocent smile. As she began walking down the aisle, Thomas's hands moved quickly over his laptop. The projector hummed to life. Now, Mike, Thomas whispered. Mike pressed the button that would switch the church's screens from the usual hymn displays to Thomas's presentation. But nothing happened. No. Thomas checked the connections frantically. Someone had unplugged their system. Looking for this? A deep voice said behind them. One of Sarah's cousins stood in the doorway, holding the main power cable. Mike tried to run, but another man blocked the door. Thomas grabbed his backpack and did the only thing he could think of. He ran straight for the emergency exit. The alarm blared through the church as Thomas burst through the door. The wedding music stopped. Everyone turned to look as he ran down the side aisle, his dress shoes clicking on the marble floor. Stop him, Sarah screamed, dropping her sweet act for the first time in public. Thomas reached the altar just as his father stepped toward him. Tommy, what are you doing? Dad, you have to listen. Thomas pulled out his tablet. She's not Sarah Mitchell. Her real name is Sharon Morris, and she's wanted by the FBI. The church erupted in chaos. Sarah's face twisted with rage as she lunged forward, but Thomas was faster. He connected his tablet to his backup projector, the one he'd hidden under a flower arrangement that morning. Suddenly, the church walls lit up with evidence, police reports, newspaper headlines, and photos of Sarah's previous victims. Her mug shots under different names flashed across the walls. She's been putting sleeping pills in your coffee, Dad, Thomas said, his voice strong now. She's stolen half your money already. And after today, she was planning to kill you. The church fell silent. Everyone stared at the evidence displayed on the walls. Sarah's fake family members started running for the exits, but church security blocked the doors. James Harrison stood frozen, looking between his son and his bride-to-be. Sarah's sweet mask finally cracked completely as she realized her game was over. You little brat, she snarled, reaching into her bouquet. Everyone gasped as she pulled out a small revolver. The church erupted in screams as Sarah pointed the gun straight at Thomas. James immediately stepped in front of his son, shielding him with his body. Get out of the way, James, Sarah snarled, all traces of her sweet personality gone. Her white wedding dress seemed to mock the chaos she had created. Your bratty son has ruined everything. Drop the weapon, a strong voice commanded from the back of the church. Aunt Jenny emerged, her police badge gleaming, her service weapon trained on Sarah. Behind her, several FBI agents moved quietly through the side doors. But Sarah just laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed through the church. You think I didn't plan for this? She backed toward the altar, keeping the gun pointed at Thomas and James. I've escaped before, and I'll do it again. Thomas could feel his father trembling as they stood together. On the church walls, the evidence was still playing. Pictures of Sarah's previous victims, newspaper headlines about mysterious deaths, bank records showing stolen millions. It's over, Sharon Morris, Aunt Jenny said, using Sarah's real name. We have the church surrounded. Your accomplices are already in custody. Sarah's eyes darted around like a trapped animal. You don't understand, she said, her voice shaking with rage. I deserve this money. I worked for months to set this up. This stupid kid ruined everything. She glared at Thomas, just like he almost ruined it when he found my pills and fake IDs. James gasped as he finally understood everything. The coffee, you were drugging me. All those times I felt dizzy and confused. Of course I was drugging you, you fool. Sarah spat. How else could I get you to sign over your accounts? Men like you, so desperate for love after their wives die, you're all the same, so easy to manipulate. Thomas felt his father's hand tighten on his shoulder. He reached into his pocket and pressed the record button on his phone, capturing every word of Sarah's confession. But you. Sarah turned her wild eyes to Thomas. You were supposed to be an easy target, too. A sad little boy missing his mommy, but you just wouldn't stop digging. The FBI agents were slowly moving closer. Sarah didn't seem to notice, lost in her angry rant. Do you know how many brats like you I've dealt with? She continued. Richard Cooper's son asked too many questions, too. Want to know what happened to him? Her smile turned cruel. Poor boy, such a tragic accident. That's a confession to murder, Aunt Jenny said clearly, her gun still steady. Put down the weapon, Sharon. Don't make this worse. But Sarah's eyes had taken on a crazed look. If I'm going down, I'm taking them with me. She aimed the gun at James's chest. Several things happened at once. Thomas pushed his father to the side. Aunt Jenny shouted, "Now!" The FBI agents rushed forward. And from behind the altar, Mike emerged from his hiding spot and swung the heavy brass flower stand, knocking the gun from Sarah's hand. Sarah screamed in rage and tried to run, but she tripped on her wedding dress. She fell hard onto the altar steps as agents swarmed around her. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent church. Sharon Morris, the lead FBI agent, announced, "You're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, attempted murder, and the murder of Richard Cooper. You have the right to remain silent." James pulled Thomas into a tight hug, his whole body shaking. "Tommy, my boy, you saved my life. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." "It's okay, Dad," Thomas whispered, hugging him back just as tightly. "I knew you believed me once you saw the evidence." As the agents led Sarah away, she turned back one last time. "I would have given you a good life, James," she said, trying to sound sweet again. "We could have been happy." "No," James replied firmly, keeping his arm around Thomas. "You would have killed me, just like you killed the others. My son saved me from you, and I've never been more proud." The guests watched in shocked silence as Sarah was escorted out of the church. Her white dress, now dirty from her fall, dragged behind her as she disappeared into a waiting FBI vehicle. Aunt Jenny walked over and hugged both Thomas and James. "Good work, kiddo," she said to Thomas. "You got your mother's brains and your father's courage." Thomas looked up at the stunning evidence still projected on the church walls. Evidence he had gathered piece by piece, risking his own safety to save his father. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The week after the failed wedding was a blur of police stations, FBI interviews, and reporters trying to get their story. Thomas sat beside his father in the FBI office as Agent Martinez spread photos across her desk, showing Sarah, now known officially as Sharon Morris, with different looks, names, and victims. "Thanks to your evidence, Thomas," Agent Martinez said, "we've connected her to 12 different cases across 5 states. Not just fraud and theft, but 2 confirmed murders." James squeezed his son's shoulder, his face pale as he looked at the photos. "How did I not see it? All the signs were there." "Don't blame yourself, Mr. Harrison," the agent replied kindly. "She was a professional con artist. She spent years perfecting her act. But your son—" She smiled at Thomas. He saw through her from the start. Later that day, they visited the bank to assess the damage. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, spread out statements showing dozens of suspicious transfers. "The good news," Mr. Peterson said, "is that we caught most of the transfers in time. Since they were made under false pretenses, we can reverse them. You'll get about 80% of your money back." "What about my company accounts?" James asked, worried. "Those too," Mr. Peterson nodded. "Your son's evidence proved the transfers were made under coercion. The sleeping pills she used on you made all contracts void. Your business is safe." Thomas watched his father's shoulders relax for the first time in days. The dark circles under James's eyes were starting to fade now that he wasn't drinking drugged coffee every morning. At home, they found their house crowded with police officers boxing up evidence from Sarah's room. They discovered more fake IDs, multiple cell phones, and detailed plans for what she would do after James's accident. "Look at this, Dad," Thomas said, pointing to a document. "She was going to make it look like you crashed your car because of your blood pressure medicine. That's why she kept hiding your real pills and giving you sleeping pills instead." James hugged his son tightly. "You didn't just save my life, Tommy. You saved everything we have. Everything your mother and I built together. That evening, Aunt Jenny visited with big news. Sharon's accomplices are talking, she announced. They're all turning on her to get lighter sentences. We now have proof she murdered Richard Cooper and possibly others. Thomas remembered Sarah's cruel words about Cooper's son who had asked too many questions. What happened to Richard Cooper's son? He asked quietly. He's safe, Aunt Jenny assured him. After his father's death, he went to live with his grandparents. In fact, she smiled, he wants to meet you. You both figured out Sharon's scheme. You were just luckier in stopping her in time. The next day, the local newspaper ran their story on the front page. Brave son stops wedding, exposes international con artist. The article praised Thomas's detective work and warned others about similar scams. James read the article at breakfast, shaking his head in amazement. You know what impresses me most? He said to Thomas. Not just that you discovered her scheme, but how carefully you gathered evidence. You didn't just act on suspicion, you found proof. I learned that from Mom, Thomas replied softly. She always said that truth needs evidence. That afternoon, they received an unexpected visitor. Richard Cooper's son, David, now 16, came with his grandparents. The two boys sat in Thomas's room, sharing their similar stories. I knew something was wrong, David said, his voice sad. But I couldn't prove it in time. When I found her real IDs, he paused, fighting tears. 2 days later, my dad had his accident. It wasn't your fault, Thomas told him firmly. And now she can't hurt anyone else. Later, watching TV together, they saw breaking news. International con artist Sharon Morris faces life sentence. The report showed Sarah in an orange prison jumpsuit being led into court. Her beautiful makeup and sweet smile were gone, replaced by a cold, angry face that showed who she really was. Dad, Thomas asked as they watched. Are you sad about, not getting married? James pulled his son close. Tommy, I'm grateful. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. And you showed me that the most important love story in my life right now is being a father to my brave, brilliant son. Thomas smiled, feeling truly safe for the first time in months. Sarah's threats could no longer hurt them. His father was safe, their home was their own again, and justice was finally being served. 6 months after the dramatic wedding day, life had changed significantly for the Harrison family. On a sunny Saturday morning, Thomas sat in the backyard with his father, looking through old family photos. The garden, once dominated by Sarah's expensive but fake decorations, was now back to its natural beauty, filled with the flowers Thomas's mother had planted years ago. Look at this one, James said, pointing to a picture of Thomas as a toddler with his mother. She would be so proud of you, Tommy. You have her intuition and her strength. The past months had been busy with court appearances and legal proceedings. Sarah, or Sharon Morris, as she was now known to everyone, had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. The evidence Thomas gathered had not only proven her crimes against the Harrisons, but had also helped convict her for the murders of 2 previous husbands. Dad, Thomas said, helping to organize the photos, do you remember what you told me when I asked if you were sad about not getting married? James smiled, putting his arm around his son. I told you that being your father was the most important love story in my life. And I meant it. They had both gone through counseling to deal with the trauma of Sarah's deception. The therapist, Dr. Roberts, had helped them understand that they weren't foolish for being deceived. They were survivors who had fought back against a skilled criminal. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. It was David Cooper and his grandparents, who had become regular visitors. David, still dealing with the loss of his father, had found healing in helping other families identify potential scammers. Look what we brought, David called out, holding up a basketball. At 16, he had become like a big brother to Thomas. Ready for a game? As the boys played basketball, James and David's grandparents sat on the porch, sharing their experiences and supporting each other. They had formed a support group for families affected by romance scams, helping others avoid similar tragedies. Later that afternoon, Aunt Jenny arrived with more news. The FBI just arrested 2 more members of Sharon's network, she announced. Your evidence helped uncover an entire international fraud ring. Thomas had become something of a local hero. The police department had even invited him to speak at schools about trusting your instincts and protecting your family from scammers. His story had been featured on national news, warning others about similar schemes. You know what's amazing? David said as they all sat down for dinner. Because of what happened, 3 other women like Sharon were caught before they could hurt anyone else. Thomas's evidence created a pattern that helped police identify other scammers. James nodded proudly. And the support group has helped 15 families recover their stolen money. Sometimes good things can come from bad situations. That evening, Thomas sat at his desk, looking at his mother's picture. He had started writing a book about his experience, hoping to help other kids trust their instincts when something felt wrong in their families. "Dear Mom," he wrote in his journal, "today Dad laughed again, really laughed, like he used to when you were here. The nightmares about Sarah are getting less frequent, and Dad's not afraid to trust his own judgment anymore. We're healing." A knock on his door interrupted his writing. It was his father, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate, the new evening ritual to replace the drugged coffee Sarah used to make. "Tommy," James said, sitting on the bed, "I wanted to tell you something. I've decided to donate part of the recovered money to start a foundation. It will help families affected by romance scams, especially families with children who might feel scared or unsure, like you did." Thomas felt tears in his eyes. "Can we name it after Mom?" "The Laura Harrison Foundation for Family Protection." James smiled. "Perfect name, isn't it?" As they sipped their hot chocolate, Thomas looked around his room. The evidence board was gone, replaced by happy family photos and his favorite soccer posters. His detective notebook was now part of the FBI's evidence file, helping to keep Sarah behind bars where she couldn't hurt anyone else. "Dad," Thomas asked softly, "do you think we'll ever be completely okay?" James hugged his son close. "We already are okay, Tommy. We have each other, we have the truth, and we have your mother's memory to guide us. Sometimes the strongest families are the ones that survive storms together." Thomas smiled, feeling the warmth of his father's words. They had survived their storm, and somehow they had come out stronger. Their story wasn't just about stopping a wedding. It was about a boy's love for his father, the strength of family bonds, and the power of truth to overcome deception.